Hi folks, I'm Pastor Steve Herring, Stated Supply Pastor at the Pine Tops Presbyterian Church, Cobb Memorial Presbyterian Church, and the Nahala Presbyterian Church. They're in Edgecombe and Halifax counties, North Carolina, if you're not familiar with the geography of the place. This is part two of three parts. We're going to do our Bible studies in shorter formats at this point. So our part one and part three are linked below on your computer screen. And our part one was dealing with the history of the Hebrew scriptures and just a rough overview of how it was that the Hebrew scriptures came to be composed and how they interacted with the history of the Hebrew people. In the history of Israel, a huge and prominent part of their history was the failure of the divided kingdom and the fact that people were taken into exile in Babylon. Now, a number of them didn't go to Babylon. A number of them ended up going to Egypt, and that created an exile community that stayed in Egypt in a place known as Alexandria. Now, Alexandria would not come to be until later in the time of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian. Macedonia is northern, the very, very northern part of Greece. And Alexander was a great military leader and ended up conquering all of the region of Judea, Egypt, and Babylonia, the place that had been ruled by the Persians. All of that country came to be under the influence of Alexander. They called him the Great. Alexander crusaded right on to India before he died. And after Alexander died, there was a reasonably orderly transition of power to a group of kings. One group of those kings were the Ptolemies, and they ruled, and they ended up with a lot of Jewish people living in their cities. And these were Jewish believers who gradually came to speak Greek, to become Greek speakers, and as Greek speakers, they thought in Greek, they read in Greek, they did everything in the Greek language. This created a need for their scriptures. We're in the 300s before Jesus, around, let's say about 350 years before Jesus was born. In that time, they gradually came to really solidify themselves into the Greek culture. That was very problematic because their scriptures were written in Hebrew. So they translated them. They translated them into the Greek language. That translation came to be known as the Septuagint. And you can see that this is the Septuagint Bible. It's in 2 volumes, and it contains the entire, got a good focus on those little guys, bring them in a little bit. Okay, there they are. Greek Old Testament, Septuagint. It's called Septuagint. Septuagint means created in 70 days because the Jews who favored this translation promoted a story that this translation was created by 70 scholars in 70 days who all came up with the same translation of the scriptures. And so The Septuagint means begotten in 70 days. And actually, I was holding up at the Greek New Testament here, and not the Hebrew, the Greek Septuagint. See, black cover there. See, now we got Septuagint on both sides, okay? Minor detail that perhaps nobody would have observed. The point is that this is a lot of scripture, okay? This is the Old Testament in Greek. And it's a very, very, very important version of the scriptures, because the Hebrew language stayed with its focus in Palestine, in the actual land of Israel and what came to be known as the Roman province of Judea. Those people stayed speaking Hebrew, conversing, writing, reading, thinking in Hebrew. Everybody else in the surrounding region would be thinking, reading, and writing in Greek. And that would include people like the Apostle Paul, and a variety of other early church fathers who would be the people who did the work of creating the Christian church in the late 1st century AD. So that is why it was, I know, for example, every time Paul quotes the Old Testament, he quotes from this version of the Old Testament. Paul does not quote, nor does he refer in any way that I've ever seen to a Hebrew set of scriptures. So the Hebrew scriptures are Judean in the sense that they precede the Greek scriptures. It's just an important note, and the reason it's important is when Jesus came along, Jesus was a Judean Samaritan Jew. Okay, he was a Galilean Jew, and the whole geography of the life of Jesus is even somewhat controversial, because best I can tell, Jesus was from Galilee, which is part north of Samaria. He, as far as we know, spoke Aramaic. Aramaic is a northern dialect of Hebrew. It uses the Hebrew alphabet, and there's only tiny portions of, say, the book of Daniel and a couple of other scriptures that are written in Aramaic. It's a northern dialect of Hebrew. Jesus, I think it's best to understand Jesus as coming from the Hebrew tradition, not the Greek tradition. Okay, that's an important consideration as far as the historic Jesus is concerned. After Jesus rose from the dead, as he was perceived by people like Paul and John, they would be writing, reading, thinking, talking in Greek. And that's why you have a Greek New Testament. This Greek New Testament this is the language of all of the scriptures: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the letters of Paul, the epistle to the Hebrews, the letters of Peter, the letters of John, the revelation of John. All of that is written in the Greek language. So our New Testament comes out of this Septuagint Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures. So that's where the faith itself comes from. Now, there's one more chapter in this development, but I'm going to do that next chapter in the next part. So our part 1, we've talked about the history of the Hebrew Scriptures. Part 2, we've talked about the history of the Greek Scriptures. Part 3, we're going to talk about the Latin Scriptures and English Scriptures from that point on. So we will pick up with part 3.